Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Legatum Institute's, to the Culture of Prosperity program, which I have the signal honour of looking after, or curating, as contemporary vocabulary has it, and to the History of Capitalism course, and to Copperopolis, to which those of you who are not intimately familiar with Copperopolis will have an exemplary introduction to its rise, fall and rise again from Professor Hugh Bowen, who's Professor of Modern History at that university. In this, the third year of the History of Capitalism course, we're looking at the phenomenon of the city, of urban life. We started the course with a chronological account of various chunks of history, the early medieval, high medieval, and then the 18th century, the 19th century, and so on. And then a study of particular themes. And now it's a study of particular individual cities that tell us something very individual about the history of economics and the history of capitalism as a force that has transformed the world. There are those who will say that study of history is a study of general laws, things that are somehow predestined and have to happen, or even things that may be predicted. And this is sometimes, unfortunately, very true of the study of economic history, with individual human beings being reduced to the level of marionettes, end of puppets on a string. But no, as I think Hugh Bowen's lecture this evening will demonstrate to us, individual human beings are the motors of history. Their decisions count. It's their decisions that really change the world. And it's that unique, you might want to say, spiritual value of the individual that comes through over and again in the history, not just of economics, but of politics and of culture generally. In the 1790s, Walter Savage Landor, who would become a celebrated, in his time, early Victorian poet, went to Swansea for the first time, and being rather keen on the visuals, you can see Swansea there in the background there. And he declared, he was an Englishman, he'd only been to, I think, South Wales once before. He'd been sent to Tenby as an adolescent to recuperate. He was a rather sickly child, and he fell in love with a local girl called Nancy. And then he decided to come back when he was a rather rebellious undergraduate. He was very radical. It was the 1790s, French Revolution was all over the place, and he decided that he disliked Tories very much. And so he took a pot shot with his gun at a fellow undergraduate at Trinity College, Oxford, whom he thought was a Tory. So this chapter arrives in Swansea, he's never seen it before, and it says, it's better than the Bay of Naples. He came from a very rich landowning family in Warwickshire, spent a lot of time travelling, and he said, I've seen the Bay of Naples, and Swansea, the Bay of Swansea, in its climate and its health, is really far better than Naples. And if I could live anywhere the rest of my times, I'd live between the Mumbles and Swansea, which was a very good judgment because that's where I spent part of my adolescent years. Well, by the 1790s, Swansea had already had, as he will be telling us, a pretty long industrial history. There are people who think in South Wales and elsewhere that the famous Merthyr Tydfil is the home of the Industrial Revolution, double ironworks and all of that. But history, as well as being revealing the spiritual power of the individual, teaches us that we've got to keep on our toes and revise our judgments all the time. So it's with great pleasure that I ask Hugh Bowen to tell us the story of Copperopolis. It's a great pleasure to have him back here. He gave a wonderful lecture in year one of the History of Capitalism course when he talked about the East India Company, on which he is the leading authority. And on Swansea, being a local boy, he knows whereof he speaks. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh Bowen.
I'd be delighted to start, but Hal's actually got my... Thank you very much, Hal, for your kind introduction. delighted to see someone here with a Swansea City Football Club badge on their jumper, which immediately makes me feel at home. Less impressed by the fact that there's someone here from Cardiff, because we'll probably have to ask him to leave the room now, because these local rivalries will be played out. Copperopolis, Swansea's Heyday, Decline and Regeneration is the title that I'm working with. Now, it might be surprising, I think, to some of you to find that Swansea features at all in a series of lectures on cities and regions that loom large in the history of capitalism. But really there is little, in fact no need perhaps, to spend much time justifying its inclusion. Strictly speaking, for much of the period to be discussed, Swansea wasn't a city at all. It only became a city in 1969. But those semantics aside, it's nonetheless almost completely dominated the development of the global copper industry. And in so doing, it exemplified the ways in which the key elements of capitalism combined to catalyse the early growth of industrialisation, not just in Wales, but in Britain. And as Howell said, when we look at the chronology of all of this, it's quite clear that Swansea is very fast out of the blocks in terms of industrialisation. So dramatic was that process that my colleague, Professor Chris Evans, speaks of a Swansea moment in world economic history. That is between about 1830 and 1870, as Swansea and its hinterland were transformed into Copperopolis, the epicentre of the first globally integrated heavy industry, the copper industry. Now, as we'll see, when we consider that process, the case of Swansea throws considerable light on some of the key avenues of inquiry that have been set out in the prospectus for this series. It will examine the making of a certain moment in time. It will explore, crucially I think, the interaction of the global and the local. And it places emphasis on how the capitalist dynamo, driven by aggressive innovative entrepreneurialism, shaped patterns of economic development and then urban development. But the Swansea case also offers scope for examination of some of the downsides to be found in the history of capitalism, as were evident in the consequences of its rapid and devastating deindustrialisation. And then, by bringing the story right up to date, the lecture will end by exploring how the legacy of that industrial past is now being incorporated into regeneration of the area. Now, when the annual conference of the British Association for the Advancement of Science paid its second visit to Swansea in 1880, the image here before you being used for publicity purposes was a view of the lower Swansea Valley, not the Bay of Naples, as it would have looked from the air. The message being conveyed was not simply that Swansea was now intelligent town, as it was being called, in other words, a Welsh crucible of modernity and intellectual inquiry, whose credentials had been really established when scholars set up the Royal Institution there in 1835. But emphasis was also placed upon the density and the intensity of its industrialisation, as you can see here in the valley floor. Many smokestacks belching out sulphurous fumes, tightly packed together, and we can see here the transport infrastructure, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's great Landor viaduct. But also, foregrounded in the image was the bustling port here, which provided the lifeblood of the town by its facilitation of a wide range of global linkages. There was a very good reason for doing this and for using this particular image. The whole area, and not only the town itself, but its hinterland, was defined by the haphazard, cheek-by-jowl development of copper smelting that had taken place over the previous 150 years or so. It's been estimated that as early as 1800, Swansea smelted about 90% of all Britain's total copper output. And by the 1860s, it was producing around 65% of total world output. The port was central to that success, but not only because it enabled the export of smelted, high-quality, refined or manufactured copper, but rather it allowed for the importation of the very large quantities of copper ore that found their way to Swansea from mines scattered right across the world. And herein lies perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story, Swansea's growth to industrial ascendancy. It had no local deposits of copper ore that it could draw on. And from the very beginning, it was wholly dependent upon imported raw materials. Now, in view of that crucial resource issue, the obvious question that needs to be addressed is why, in the absence of copper ore deposits, did the smelting industry locate in the lower Swansea Valley in the first place? Well, the answer lies in the agency provided by a small number of highly mobile and innovative entrepreneurs who had the capital, the knowledge, and the practical skills that were necessary to organise long-distance supply chains. Small-scale smelting of copper had been undertaken in the nearby Neath Valley in the 16th century, but Bristol emerged as the main centre of British smelting during the 17th century. Bristol here, where local merchants took advantage of relatively local Cornish copper ore deposits, which were shipped to the port of Bristol and smelted in the locality using charcoal as fuel. When local sources of charcoal were depleted in and around Bristol, there was a move to the Wye Valley here, and in particular to Redbrook, which became a small cradle of industrialisation that's almost entirely off the map now, but it was the local access to timber that was so crucial then. But in the face of further resource depletion, a search then began for more sustainable places of production. Technological advance was achieved by the development of coal-fired reverberatory furnaces, and the search began for suitable coal deposits. That search extended right the way along the South Wales coast, and by 1717, it was calculated and estimated that the Swansea Valley here provided the ideal location for large-scale copper smelting. The reason being that the lower Swansea Valley possessed not only two incredibly rich seams of easily extracted coal, but it had a suitably navigable river, the River Towie, which was capable of taking larger ocean-going vessels. Now, the key factor in that transfer of the industry to Swansea lay in the fact that 3 tons of coal at that point were required to smelt 1 ton of ore. And this meant that it was far more economical to ship Cornish ore to Swansea than it was to take coal to Cornwall. Moreover, the emerging Welsh method of smelting ore in reverberatory furnaces required up to 20 successive roastings in long lines of smelters, and this served only to increase the amount of coal that was required. So Swansea became hitched for the next 150 years to Cornwall, and the rise of the Cornish copper mining industry was inextricably bound up with smelting in Swansea. Now, the first operational smelter in Swansea was that at Landore, belonging to a man called John Lane of Bristol. And he was the forerunner of a very significant number of inward investors in an area where local gentry wealth, although not entirely absent from industrial enterprise, was limited. Others followed him from Bristol, such as members of the Costa family, who had strong links with the West African slave trade, which was oiled, funded by copper trade items. But London-based financiers also spotted the emerging opportunities, and at the forefront, in 1729, was Richard Lockwood, a merchant who had very strong links with the Levant Company and the City of London. Of course, as he himself recognised, finance was no guarantee of success without technological expertise and a skilled labour force. And recognising this, Lockwood formed a partnership with Robert Morris, originally from Shropshire, where he'd undertaken iron smelting operations, who had acted as the Landor Works manager before Lane went bankrupt. This type of combination of finance and expertise was then replicated time and again in the next century and a half. First by Bristol and London-based individuals, who were then followed by entrepreneurs from Birmingham and Cornwall. By 1730, those pioneers had established a connection between resources, expertise, and capital. But to make the nascent copper industry sustainable, it was necessary to ensure that there was a steady demand for its products. Otherwise, there would be no takeoff of the industry. Curiously, demand is often absent from studies of economic history because emphasis is generally placed on the supply side. But all forms of capitalism are dependent ultimately on demand for goods and services. In this case, a key element in the development of the Swansea copper industry was provided by overseas markets. Some products early on went to the slave trade through the Bristol connection and to consumer markets in colonial America. But rising amounts of copper were directed towards India via the East India Company. Through Richard Lockwood's connections with the city, Lockwood, Morris and Company were the early beneficiaries of the East India Company's attempts to open up Asian markets to British copper from 1730 onwards. And this formed an enduring relationship which provided an expanding outlet for their bars, their ingots, their sheets, and their manufactured items, kettles, saltpeter boiling pans, and so on. The expansion then of British India from 1750 onwards provided further scope for expansion, and a second wave of Swansea companies, established by men such as the serial industrialist Chauncey Townsend, were all involved in the East India trade, which by 1780 was accounting for between a quarter and a sixth of total British output. Indeed, the successful and very rapid penetration of Indian markets by the copper smelting firms of South West Wales had a considerable long-term effect upon the maritime economy of Asia. A recent detailed study by a Japanese economic historian demonstrates that from the 1760s onwards, the importation of copper from Britain eclipsed completely the long-established inward flow of that commodity from Japan. And this process of substitution enables the author to claim, I think with some degree of justification, that it was, I quote, British copper, not British cotton textiles, which acted as the harbinger of the Industrial Revolution to the world economy. A very bold claim. But underpinning that is the fact that virtually all of that copper was now being produced in Swansea by 8 smelting works located in very close proximity to one another. Until about 1780, copper smelted in Swansea used Cornish ore, supplemented by small quantities that were shipped in from southern Ireland. But Anglesey, the island of Anglesey in North Wales, then emerged as a new source of supply. This was largely a result of the aggressive entry into the industry of Thomas Williams, a North Wales solicitor who has been described as the near dictator of the copper industry. Extraordinarily entrepreneurial, Williams had secured the rights to mine large ore deposits that were discovered on Paris Mountain on Anglesey, and he then embarked on an ambitious attempt to exert control over the entire British industry. He proved to be remarkably efficient and systematic in his organisation of the supply, the production and the distribution chain, a process that brought, I think, an unprecedented and unparalleled degree of integration and cohesion to the industry. He did everything. This meant that in addition to his mining interests, he purchased both the upper and middle bank smelting works in Swansea. He obtained a fleet of ore-carrying vessels to transport the raw materials to Swansea, and he then established a rolling mill on the River Thames near Henley, which enabled him to supply copper sheathing to the Royal Navy. He was ruthless in his price-cutting strategy, which was aimed at his main Cornish mining competitors, and relentless in his pursuit of overseas markets, which meant that by the 1790s, he'd been able to establish a near monopoly over supply to the East India Company. It's perhaps little wonder then that Williams's biographer labelled him the Copper King. Now, Thomas Williams flashed like a comet over Britain's late 18th century industrial landscape, although, surprisingly perhaps, he does not loom large in economic histories of Britain. He died in 1802, and although his enterprise survived for another 23 years in the form of Williams, Grenville and Company, his legacy was not enduring because the supplies of ore from Anglesey were exhausted shortly after the time of his passing. Now, that loss of supply represented a serious problem for Swansea because its smelters found that it was becoming evident that Cornish ore was no longer sufficient alone to sustain an industry that was still expanding fast, not least through the development of the Cornish entrepreneur John Vivian's new state-of-the-art Havard works, which we see here, I hope, there. Yes, perhaps a foggy day in the lower Swansea Valley, but that was established in 1810, went into production that year. And then the adjacent Morver works of Foster, Grenville and Company, which opened in 1835 and was destined to become the largest enterprise of its type in Europe. Now, that ore supply crisis was the catalyst that fully extended the global reach of the Swansea copper industry. A worldwide search for alternative sources of ore was initiated during the 1820s. And that process, about which we know, in fact, remarkably little, saw Swansea connected with far-flung mines on several different continents. Shipments of ore from Chile first arrived during 1823, and the ports of Valparaiso and Coquimbo soon became vital nodal points in the supply chain, as Swansea copper barks, which were known as Cape Horners, plied the notoriously difficult trade route around the Cape of Cape Horn to and from the west coast of South America. Similar supply chains were established from Cuba, where ore was mined by slaves operating under the harshest of regimes at the infamous El Cobre mine, which was partly run by the Grenville family, and from South Australia, where at Burra, the monster mine there produced ore that was shipped to Swansea from Port Adelaide during the 1850s. Other sources tapped over time were located in the United States, Montana, New Mexico, Canada and British Columbia, South Africa and different parts of Europe. The value that was added to the volume of this global trade lay in the fact that the quality of the ores was much greater than those located closer to home, with the copper content per tonne being about twice that still being extracted from Cornish and Irish mines. Now, that reconfiguration of the copper trade put Swansea itself at the heart of a worldwide network which facilitated flows not only of raw materials and finished products, but also migrant labour expertise and knowledge. And perhaps that explains why there are 26 Swanseas located around the world as migrant labourers established their own townships. And as I always like to joke to my students, there are 26 Swanseas around the world, but I think only 2 Cardiffs. The price of copper was set in Swansea, and global connections were deeply inscribed into the townscape, home to some 15,000 people in 1821, but 31,000 people in 1851. Now, this was through the establishment of consulates. There were 7 consulates in Swansea in 1851, among them Venezuela, Mexico, and so on, to facilitate shipping arrangements, but also in the naming of wharves, the Alcobre Wharf, streets, Adelaide Street, public houses, and hotels, the Cuba Hotel, the New Mexico Fountain Inn, and so on. The effect that the copper industry had on the development of Swansea itself was profound. The Great Western Railway arrived in 1853, a process that was facilitated by Brunel's construction of that extensive Landau viaduct, which we saw on the first slide, which spanned not just the River Tawe, but also some of the copper works that were nestled beneath on its banks. The 9 major works operating in 1850 provided employment for some 10,000 men, women, and children. The wealth generated by the copper magnates enabled estates and country houses to be established around the edge of the beautiful Swansea Bay, in picturesque places such as Singleton, Clyne, and Grenville Park. And it trickled into the burgeoning urban infrastructure through the construction of the aforementioned Royal Institution, as well as banks, shipping offices, assembly rooms, and a multitude of chapels and churches. More prosaically, copper magnates sought to provide housing and basic amenities for some of their workforces. And this gave rise to the satellite industrial towns of Morristown, Viviantown, and Grenville Town, all taking the name of the copper magnates. These have been strangely neglected, I think, in the literature on the planned company towns of the 19th century, yet they were in many ways highly innovative, and their imprint is still very visible today, even though they've been subsumed into the wider urban environment. Now, of course, one must be careful not to exaggerate the localised effects of growth of the copper industry on the overall development of the port and town of Swansea, because the very nature of copper smelting was such that output and the size of the workforce were both modest by comparison with the coal industry and then the later emerging ferrous metal industries of the region. Nonetheless, the effects of interconnected copper-related expansion upon Swansea are reflected across a range of statistical indicators. Equally, it's important not to portray the development of the industry wiggishly, as it were, as an unqualified triumph of the onward and upward march of industrial capitalism. The human costs were very considerable indeed, not least because copper smelting required long hours of hard labour in intense heat and an atmosphere poisoned by the constant output of noxious sulphurous fumes that were produced when arsenic and other impurities were burnt off during the roasting processes. The works themselves were blighted by the existence of giant waste tips formed by these byproducts, and the surrounding landscape became devoid of plant, tree, and animal life, as the ever-present copper smoke took a heavy toll on the natural environment. The effects were to transform a once scenic valley into a vision of a living hell. And this was very much reflected in artistic representations. Visitors were often attracted to visit the valley at night time, so that the dramatic impact of the 24-hour smelting process could be seen. This, taken from 1830, I think, conveys that impression very powerfully. And another French representation from 1865 from La Tour du Monde gives a heavily stylized view of what the valley looked like. But I think, we have that strong sense of very intense industrialization and activity. But of course, above it all, atop the, by then, hundreds of smelting chimneys, the noxious fumes blowing onto the surrounding hills. As one poet put it in 1897, "It came to pass in days of yore, the devil chanced upon Landor. Quoth he, by all this fume and stink, I can't be far from home, I think." And that neatly sums it up. Now, if the construction of global supply chains of ore represented a remarkable achievement for those involved in the copper industry, then so too it sowed the seeds of its ultimate decline and demise. For economic logic dictated the creation of either shorter supply lines or indeed more tightly integrated operations in which smelting took place as close to copper mines as possible. Smelting in places in Chile had occurred on a small scale since 1830, but a more robust challenge to Swansea became a reality from the 1850s onwards as more extensive and systematic smelting was undertaken in South America generally, North America and Australia, as large coal seams were opened up there. Now, ironically, Swansea knowledge and labour played a key role in that process, the outward migration, if you like, of the industry, as workers moved and took their skills with them. But technological improvements to furnaces also played their part. If Swansea smelters were ultimately unable to prevent their loss of a tight grip on the global copper industry, which was fully manifesting itself by about 1880, they were certainly not passive in their acceptance of decline. Most of them, both by inclination and outlook, had always been portfolio capitalists, and as such had run multiple enterprises. During the 1850s, for example, Vivian and Company also operated an ironworks, a cobalt and nickel works, and a phosphate plant close to their major Havard works. And when in 1874 it took over the nearby White Rock copper smelting copper works, smelting there was ended and replaced by silver and lead refining. Diversification and adaptation were the name of this particular survival game, and the effect of this was evident in the type and the distribution of enterprise that was emerging just as the tag Copperopolis was being widely applied to Swansea. It was calculated in 1883, for example, that within a 5-mile radius of the centre of Swansea, there were now 36 collieries, 8 ironworks, 6 tin works, 3 steel works, 6 spelter or zinc works, 12 copper works, 5 fuel works, and 13 miscellaneous works. Now, this represented a very powerful second wave of industrialisation, and the effects of this were evident in 1908, when the Daily Mail produced one of its Sunday supplement guides to the industrial towns and cities of Britain and featured Swansea. The map that was published on the front page demonstrated that the lower Swansea Valley was now arguably the most intensively and diversely industrialised parts of Great Britain. That's this area here, which is no more than probably 5 miles from the port up to what is now the motorway. You can't see it very clearly here, but the names of all the plants are given and what they were all doing. And there's a bewildering array of activities. It's a very useful source, this. Gives guides to the industries of Swansea and advice on where to live in Swansea. How you'd be delighted to know that Dover and Vour features in that guide. Yet that process of diversification could not mask the long-term decline of the copper industry in the face of ferocious international competition. Smelting ceased in 1924, and although mergers and takeovers enabled the manufacturing of semi-refined copper to continue at the unified Havard and Morver works until 1980, most works were either given over to other forms of metallurgical production or abandoned to become derelict. Together with the deeply polluted landscape and the general effects of the interwar depression, this created a very strong sense of stagnation and decay, which then accelerated after 1945, to the point that the Lower Swansea Valley became the largest post-industrial landscape in Western Europe. A beginning of the problem, I think, is apparent from this first aerial photograph from 1929, which shows the Havard and Morver works here, crammed into the bottom of a very narrow valley between the River Towy, which is here, and the all-important Swansea Canal running along here. But there are two reasons really to use this slide, I think. One is the extraordinary combination of transport infrastructure, railways, tramways, canals, roads, etc., but also the enormous waste tips, one there, one in the middle of the works, which had a sulfuric acid plant built on the top of it, but then the devastated local hills, Kilvey Hill overlooking the valley, something akin to the surface of the moon. That was the epicenter of the operation as the industry came to an end in its smelting capacity in 1924. So what about regeneration? Where does it go from here? Well, processes of regeneration were evident in Swansea from the late 1950s onwards. And just as it was one of the first places in Britain to experience intensive industrialisation, so too it was the first to attempt a strategic programme to reverse deindustrialisation and environmental degradation. The problems were complex and interlocking, but the simple underlying motivation was that something had to be done to offset the ravages of capitalism that now manifested themselves in mile after mile of dereliction. Scenes such as this, a photograph from 1963 of White Rock copper works, which had been set up in the 1920s, by this point had been more or less abandoned, and the all enterprise departed. Kilvey Hill in the background here, but it's an extraordinary scene of a ghost-like landscape abandoned by humans. The site of the former Llansamlet arsenic works at the top end of the valley are deeply polluted. Nowadays there's an Asda supermarket on the site, so I suppose that's some form of progress. This abandonment had taken place in an environment that was largely unregulated, of course, at a time when notions of corporate responsibility were almost non-existent. The response took the form of what became known as the Lower Swansea Valley Project, which had its origins in 1960 in meetings convened by a man called Robin Hughes-Jones, who was the director of social administration courses in what is now Swansea University. Now that process brought together members of the university and borough council together under the chairmanship of the principal at the time, the historian J.H. Parry. The following year, the group was formalised as a committee, and the emerging project was supported by grants of almost £50,000, including £22,500 from the Nuffield Trust. The scope of the task was at once recognised as being very considerable indeed. As the project's published report of 1967 put it, and I quote, "The Lower Swansea Valley is notorious for its blighted appearance. This once economically active area has in large part become derelict and is now covered with the ruins and mounds of industrial debris. There are acres of noxious land that bear no vegetation at all. Over the rest, the vegetation is so poor that it accentuates the bleakness of the scene. This blighted area lies at Swansea's front door, for it adjoins the principal railway station and is only a few minutes by road from the high street and the docks. The town suffers accordingly in reputation, morale, and in its economy. The aim of the project was thus sharply defined in the following way: to establish the factors which inhibit the social and economic use of land in the lower Swansea Valley, and to suggest ways in which the area should in future be used. Now, to achieve this, studies undertaken within the university were divided broadly into two types: those which examined the physical problems of the valley floor itself, and those which undertook socio-economic analysis of the resident and industrial populations. These studies generated 12 reports, which incorporated numerous detailed recommendations, and they ranged widely from the human ecology of the valley through to analysis of the many tips and volumes of material that were contained within them. In passing, some very intriguing suggestions were made, including a proposal not only to build an aircraft landing strip, but also a helicopter port. Now, it was acknowledged at the outset that this type of project was unprecedented, and one can only be struck by the boldness of the ambition and method. It was the sort of venture that any modern-day Vice-Chancellor would cry out for, because it ticked so many of the boxes that now need to be ticked in an academic environment in which research is now assessed for its impact and public engagement. It involved extensive collaboration: the college, the university, Borough Council, the Welsh Office, and also industry. It was multidisciplinary, with projects centred on 6 academic departments. It involved pure and applied research and what is now known as knowledge transfer. It had the potential to have very considerable local impact and effect. And it did deliver very considerable levels of community activity, most notably and visibly through the planting of many thousands of trees by local schools, clubs, and societies. As such, it represented a prototype for large-scale socio-economic regeneration projects, and it attracted very considerable interest because it provided a model for actions in other blighted post-industrial areas. Visitors from across Europe and the wider world came to inspect the area and discuss what was widely referred to as Swansea's experimental method. Now, the many and varied recommendations of the project were never translated directly into action, but instead they framed discussion of the development processes implemented by successive local authorities. Some recommendations were ignored altogether, others eventually found incarnations, but not in ways originally anticipated. The 6 parks that would have been host to different forms of economic activity were never delivered, although some of the ideas found expression in the creation of an enterprise zone and a retail park. Crucially, though, there was extensive land clearance and soil remediation, which provided the necessary preconditions for the development of housing, leisure, and sporting activity. And the end product was a valley that was not only green again, with the white rock works that we saw earlier on this side here. If I didn't tell you where that was, you wouldn't necessarily think that it was the lower Swansea Valley. It has a very attractive appearance. It's not just green, but capable of sustaining new forms of economic enterprise. What, of course, is so striking, I suppose, is the contrast between a process of industrialisation, which was sparked by individual entrepreneurs using private funds, and a programme of regeneration that was now being implemented by public sector organisations using public finance. And we're left today with images such as these, which I've chosen to, contrast the modern and the historical. An 18th century quayside here, and brand new sports stadium the Liberty Stadium here. The river, once densely and deeply polluted, now back to life, host to all sorts of water leisure activities, home to fish in a way that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. But one notable casualty of regeneration was the rich metallurgical heritage of the area, because a guiding principle of the Lower Swansea Valley project was that the destruction of industrial remains was a necessary precursor to improvement and progress. At a time before the statutory protection of significant historic buildings was in place, it was deemed imperative to turn a back on Swansea's poisoned and polluted past so that it could be freed from a historic straitjacket and thus participate in a shining new world of the 1960s that was to be dominated by new build. Indeed, the project made no direct connection at all between the area's industrial past and its future development. The past was seen as a problem to be solved, and the response was the systematic and indiscriminate destruction of nearly all of the industrial remains in the Lower Swansea Valley. They were blown up Saturday after Saturday by the Territorial Army engaged on training exercises. There appears to have been no archaeological study or survey of the buildings, and no attempt was made to even make the case for selective presentation. Consequently, what has survived, such as these two engine houses, appears to have survived purely by chance or accident, and the listing process did not get properly underway till some time later. Now, in many ways, this is not surprising. Industrial heritage was not yet widely seen as acting as an agent for positive change or regeneration. And it's noteworthy, I think, that the word heritage does not appear anywhere in the report of 1967 or indeed in subsequent conference proceedings of the 1970s, which is a reminder, I think, of just how recently that word has come to feature in our lexicon. Now, the overall effect of this process was that by 2010, almost all of the remains of Swansea's industrial past had been swept away. And the past was not looming at all large in the public consciousness, as people and communities often struggled to adapt to their place in a post-industrial world. There was not one single information sign or interpretation board anywhere in the Lower Swansea Valley, even to indicate what had happened there. And the distinctiveness of the area had been almost entirely eradicated by the onward march of generic forms of housing, retail and service sector development. Here we have an aerial view which corresponds to that I showed you earlier from 1929, where we have the almost obligatory retail park, modern housing development, some light industry, and then the Liberty Stadium here. Taken from a slightly different view, you get another perspective on it. Further up, call centres, etc., etc. In 2011, though, historians and others at Swansea University sought to address this problem, this lack of public awareness, through the implementation of a project that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council called the Global and Local Worlds of Welsh Copper, which alongside its academic research component placed very heavy emphasis upon raising public awareness of Swansea's place in the world as a leading centre of industry, innovation and entrepreneurship. By any measure, I think that proved to be very successful indeed, and demonstrated emphatically that a wide cross-section of local society wished to reconnect with the area's history and heritage. But then a sudden and unexpected broadening of the project occurred in 2012, when the City and County of Swansea issued a marketing brief aimed at attracting commercial development to the site of the former Havard and Morver works, which is this area here. And that happens by chance to contain a number of listed buildings, 12 of them, of listed buildings and structures. It's a 12.5 acre site, and it includes the iconic Vivian engine house, one of which contains a very rare Musgrave engine that once powered the rolling mills. There was a very strong sense that these last tangible remains of the copper industry should not be lost or be subsumed within unsympathetic developments. And a case was put forward for a programme of heritage-led regeneration that would be shaped by the area's copper heritage. Now, as a result of those representations, the university emerged as the city's preferred development partner for the site, and the CU at Swansea project was born. CU as in the copper symbol from the periodic table, sorry. Never was a chemist. Absolutely. Now, in the first phase, the project made the site safe and accessible to the public. It installed trails and interpretation of the type that you can see here. Hitherto, this had been inaccessible and distinctly unsafe. It also, though, created a framework for sustainable mixed use through feasibility studies, remediation work, and master planning defined with close reference to the area's historic character. It must be stressed, I think, that what we're trying to do here is not create a museum or a heritage park, because far too many of those have proved to be costly and unsustainable. There will certainly be on site a living history laboratory, drawing on a wide range of digital, virtual reality and handheld mobile technologies that are being developed within the university, which can be applied to the interpretation, the better awareness and clearer understanding of Swansea's multiple contributions to the Industrial Revolution. Indeed, the research and educational possibilities associated with the project are very considerable indeed. But important though that is, the project aspires to rather more than better engagement with the past. The second phase, which is currently underway, centres on working with private sector partners and the community to undertake a programme of building restoration which will ensure that businesses will secure sustainable futures for the site and generate revenue for its future maintenance. Here we have an initial focus on copper and copper-related technologies to ensure that as much enterprise as possible moves with the historic grain rather than against it, as so often has happened in the past. I think this is both crucial for branding, but also for distinctiveness. But the site also has considerable potential for the enhancement of traditional industrial craft businesses, as well as the development of new green technologies centred on a land and marine environment that is slowly coming back to life. With the core of buildings brought into use and creating jobs, the rest of the site will become a much more attractive proposition. And in line with the master plan, the aim is to attract in commercial investment for housing, leisure and social amenities that can be located on the extensive empty spaces. We have buildings such as this, the last remaining rolling mill from 1828, Europe's largest building of its type at that time, which offers, I think, quite a lot of potential. This is some of the work that has been undertaken already. The laboratory building there, which we've stabilised, which is where all the incoming ores were assayed and tested. This is the bed of the Swansea Canal. We can't put water back into it, but what we've done temporarily is create a sort of small eco park there, and people can walk through that and inspect remains on a sort of voyage of discovery. And we've installed artworks such as the type you can see here. These were designed in association with local primary school children who prepared for us a series of templates in a competition, which were then translated into the final form by an artist. So we have these sorts of images. Harvard Primary School is inscribed into all of this, and I think that's very important to give the local community a stake in what is happening on their doorstep. The programme that we're undertaking, I think, has enormous potential to add very considerable real value to the wider existing economic regeneration plans for the city by attracting visitors, if you like, cultural tourists, and facilitating the social, cultural and educational regeneration of the local community through routine use of and creative interaction with the site in the spaces that will be given over to public use. Moreover, it will also help to create a stronger sense of place and identity, civic consciousness perhaps, amongst those who still live and work in the area, reconnecting the local with the global, if you like. Well, this sounds very high-minded and idealistic. Will it work? Certainly, I think as we move towards the full emergence of what is now being described as an experience economy, it's clear that even in an age of austerity, heritage, broadly defined, can act as a powerful catalyst for inward investment, the creation of jobs and the development of old and new skills. Of course, the pump usually has to be primed through grant income, but the value and distinctiveness of historic buildings do have the capacity to enable creative engagement with the private sector. And a lot of research points to the added value that historic buildings bring to business activity, businesses who might be in search of their own heritage, as it were. Now, of course, industrial heritage poses its own challenges, but the signs are positive, and we've already demonstrated the ability to attract firm commitment from the private sector, where businesses see the value of aligning with a striking historic narrative. This alignment is now also occurring beyond the narrow boundaries of our site. The nearby Liberty Stadium that I've pointed out to you is drawing on copper heritage themes during its latest phases of development and internal refurbishment. And perhaps it's no coincidence that this season the playing colours of Wales's only Premier League football club, Swansea City, are white and copper. Now, this lecture has focused on almost the entire life cycle of an industry and the way it has shaped the rise, decline and regeneration of a city and its hinterland. In order to explain properly that historic experience and its legacy, emphasis has been placed upon the importance of interactions between the local and the global, but such interactions do not happen by accident. The capitalist dynamo was the crucial agent of that interaction, and it was the ambitions, knowledge, skills, resources and risk-taking of individuals that forged the complex, interconnected processes that underpinned the creation of Copperopolis. Those processes were taken to the absolute limit in the late 19th century, and Swansea suffered the consequences when the dynamo slowed. The current reinvention of the city is now being driven by multiple different dynamos. But I very much hope that an important one will prove to be that which draws its strength and its inspiration directly from Swansea's rich industrial past. Thank you.